Boo! Hey guys! So today I'm going to talk about the read alouds that I've loved, kids' favorite books to read, and just other recommendations whether we've actually read them aloud or not. So let's get started. Let's get the camera straight here. So if you guys are new to my channel, my name is Rachel. I'm a homeschooling mom to 3 kids aged 8 to 15. Doing driver's ed this summer, you guys. This is a little bit surreal. All right, so here's my stack of books, but this is not all encompassing because some of the book recommendations I have we got from the library or we borrowed. I'm gonna split this video kind of into 4 categories. My favorite read alouds, what my kids, some of their favorite reads are, and then I have a couple books that I think are must reads, especially for junior high, middle school, and up. And then I'm gonna end with historical read alouds. So historical fiction that is just excelente. So first of all, let me say this. If you are looking for fantastic book recommendations, I've talked about this book before in my supplies video. Honey for a Child's Heart. This tells you how to pick out good literature. It has even some poetry in it, but then it just has a ton of book lists for different categories. So picture books for children age 4 to 8, picture books, chapter books for children age 9 to 12, chapter books for teenagers. And then they put the lists like this where you see the title and who it's written by clearly and a little synopsis. And then if you have the book or if you've already read it, you could use these lines to give it a rating, I guess. And then they also have so if the book has won any honors like Newbery Award winner, it'll be noted there. So this is an older version. They have a new updated one to include newer literature now. So for favorite read alouds, The Mouse and the Motorcycle by Beverly Cleary. This was a favorite of my son's when he was younger. So there's 3 books in this series. Anything by Beverly Cleary, though, is going to be a good book. So she's the one who also wrote like the Ramona and Beezus books, Henry Huggins. Beverly Cleary is a good author. So this is about a mouse who gets a shiny new motorcycle and goes off when a mouse gets a motorcycle. All kinds of adventures can happen. Charlotte's Web, not a new title to you, but if you haven't read this aloud to your children yet, you need to. The thing that I like about E.B. White and his writing is he has a lot of big words and a lot of big ideas in there, but they're not too difficult that your children can't have a conversation with you about it. You can think about the context of that word. I love looking up words to explain to my kids what different words mean, but this is why having good quality literature to help expand our vocabulary is so important and also so fun. Freckle Juice by Judy Blume. This was a book that I liked when I was a kid. This looks like a picture book, but it's actually a short chapter book. You can get it in a smaller form. And it's got 5 really short chapters. They're illustrated. I think I read it aloud in a half an hour to them. But this little boy right here, he really wanted freckles. And he had a schoolmate who was kind of like Nellie Olson from Little House on the Prairie. She was ornery and sold him a recipe for freckle juice. And so what happened with that is very interesting. I have not read this book, The One and Only Ivan, but it was recommended to me by one of my very dear friends who goes to my church. She thought it was a really fun book. It's on my list for this year. So The One and Only Ivan is about a gorilla in a zoo, and whatever happens is from the gorilla's perspective. And I believe I also saw from the Brave Writer website that Julie Bogart had an arrow guide for The One and Only Ivan. So if you're into the Julie Bogart arrow guides, there's one out there for that. Another book that we really enjoyed is one of Sarah Mackenzie's book recommendations. So before I tell you this book, let me say that is another place where I get book recommendations is from the Read Aloud Revival. The podcast itself, she has lots of discussions with various authors, and at the end of every single podcast, she has children calling in and telling her what their favorite books are and why. So you're just introduced and get given brief summaries to a lot of different kinds of books. On the Read Aloud Revival website, she also has free book lists available for all kinds of categories. Again, Christmas book lists for all whatever month it is. She has struggling reader book lists, chapter books that teenage boys would enjoy, just whatever you can think of, good quality literature. So Sarah McKenzie, one of her book list recommendations is The Penderwicks. So The Penderwicks is a series of, I want to say at least 4 books, but maybe there's more than that. We actually listened to the book on audiobook, and we did it like over the summer because we were traveling a lot to go to various parks and for bike rides or vacation, and it's always fun to bring an audiobook along. I really liked whoever was the voice in the Penderwick audio book because she changed her voice up for every single character, so it was very easy to follow along. But the Penderwicks is about 4 sisters in their summer adventure at their lake house or cabin or wherever they were for the summer. They were there for a little bit longer than just a vacation. And they met a boy who was the son of the landlady of the house that they were in. And so they kind of sucked the boy into some of their fun adventures. I've talked about this book before in my book recommendations playlist, which I'll link up here. And I will link it down below, and anything I can link down below I will. So this is the Big Book of Virtues, and it's a very big book, and it needs to be in every single home. It's not like a book that you read front to back, like it's not a big story. It is broken up by character traits that you might want to teach your kids. So if you're working on these sorts of character traits, so self-discipline, friendship, honesty, loyalty, those sorts of things, and this is exactly how the book is organized. So for self-discipline, for example, you have, whatever character trait we're working on. There are short stories, there are Bible stories, there's poetry in here, there's fables, there's just a lot of variety of very, very, very good literature and just really good and beautiful stuff that's kind of all in this compilation. This needs to be in every single home. And then this last book here in this group of our favorite read alouds, you may have never heard of. It's a Christian author, John Trent. This is called The Black and White Rainbow. It's an allegory. And so in this little mouse world, they had their color. They woke up one day and all the color was gone from their world and everything was black and white, including the rainbow, which what a tragedy. And so the protagonist in this story was kind of like kicked out, and he kind of kept sailing and sailing until he fell into this other world where there was color again. And when he talked to those people, it was like this other hero figure helped them get back their color and how they were able to get back their color. So really, the overall theme of the story, because it's a Christian allegory, okay? So our world being black and white and stolen, this is kind of like what it's like with sin in our life. So the one who stole the color was like Monty the Mole, who hates the light, he hates the color, but they were able to get their color restored. So there are Christian themes here. Really good book. I think I read this to my kids over a series of 2 or 3 days. So I did not read it the whole way through because there's a lot to talk about and discuss in that book. At any time during this video, comment below if there is a read aloud that you think is a must read that the rest of us need to know about. Please recommend some things below that you think should have been on my list. So next I'm going to talk about the books that my children love to read. So my children are not huge readers. I wouldn't say that their taste for literature is top-notch quality. For example, my 12-year-old daughter right now reads The Babysitter's Club. I owned like almost every single Babysitter's Club book when I was a teenager. It's okay literature, if you read it as well, but I wouldn't say like, oh, this is stellar. I wouldn't recommend it to you as being this, oh, you definitely have to introduce your children to that. So I'm only recommending the ones that I really think this is high quality. So my 8-year-old, speaking of high quality, okay, high quality literature for an 8-year-old, okay, this one might be debatable, but I mentioned in one of my other videos that she is loving the A to Z mystery. These are kind of like easy chapter books. They're a little bit of an older series. They're not necessarily writing new books of these, I don't think. I know they have a mystery book for every single letter of the alphabet. It's usually, the title is an alliteration that has to do with that letter. They also have every month of the year, they have a mystery book. But they're just fun little chapter books, and if you have a child who likes a good mystery, this is a good way to start. So my middle child really enjoyed Black Beauty. So Black Beauty is written in a lot of different forms. This is kind of like a step-up classic. It's kind of like a pretty easy reader, but it got the whole gist of the story in there. I've seen this as picture books, and I'm sure the actual novel, which I don't have, I'm sure it's a little bit longer and wordier. This is a story of a horse who falls into some cruel owners. So it's not like super happy-go-lucky, but I know she read it when she was 11, and she really enjoyed the storyline a lot. So if you have a horse lover, you can't skip out on Black Beauty. And then my son, he's kind of a nonfiction kind of guy. So he's always liked the Who Was books and the You Wouldn't Want To books, stuff about like what actually happened. He's not really a fiction guy anymore, but when he read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis, he enjoyed both of those books. As you probably know, those are also allegories with a Christian theme, but anybody can enjoy them. I mean, Disney made The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe into the Chronicles of Narnia. So I'm sure that you've heard of those books, and I don't need to explain those, but anything by C.S. Lewis is probably going to be really good too. Okay, so for older readers, I have two recommendations for you. One, Where the Red Fern Grows. This is a pretty big book with pretty little words. You could read this aloud to younger readers, but if you're going to like hand it to your child to read, I would say junior high or older. This is a book for dog lovers because these two dogs are like really, really close. And of course, the boy owner, it's a tearjerker. Kind of compare it to The Incredible Journey or like an Old Yeller type book. But I also believe this might also have a movie because I think when I was a kid, my teacher read this to us and then we watched a movie. I don't know how old the movie is, but if you have an animal lover, this is a great book. And then this book needs to be on every single high schooler's must-read list. It needs to be a requirement for graduation, and that is Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington. My son is reading this for his The Good and the Beautiful Language Arts High School Level 1, and I'm reading it with him, so we have two different bookmarks in here. I had never read this before, but this book is so good with so many pertinent themes today. I feel like politically and culturally, conversations that we're having, you could compare what somebody's firsthand account actually was. Because Booker T, this is a true story, Booker T was born a slave, and then when he was like 10 or 11, the Emancipation Proclamation was read. And so you get his perspective of from slavery through Reconstruction. I think the book was written in 1901, so he's like 50, 60 years old by the time he wrote this book. But he really, first of all, he expresses patriotism, really the opportunities that America affords. I mean, he came from slavery and yet was able to save money to put himself through school. He gives a very good depiction of what life was like in the South, but also in the North, because that's where his school was. He advocates for hard work, for saving money, for not being lazy. He calls that sort of stuff out. Like he observes things and talks about it. He also talks about the complexity of the time, which I think is fascinating. Again, firsthand account. It's really easy for historians today who didn't live back then to interpret history through the filter of 2022. But this was through the filter of 1860s and 1870s, 1880s and such. But one of the early things that he talked about was when the Emancipation was read to them, they were of course happy. They were free now. But then he said but later that night, it all of a sudden dawned on him, what do we do now? Because the slaves had no homes of their own. They didn't know where do you go to get a job. And then the same thing he points out for the white slave owners. He said their children really had no skills. So there was still this kind of like codependency that they had on each other. They still had to work together, but a very, very complex time. He also talks about how he did not come from like cruel slave owners. It's really interesting, and it's made me want to read other firsthand accounts. One of the other things, there's so much I could say about this book, but one of the other things that he really dives deep into is how much, especially for slaves back then, how much they valued education, because it was illegal to teach slaves to read, so not many of them knew how to read. And he talks about this time where they found out somebody knew how to read, and they scraped around for newspaper, and they gathered around and just had this one person read to them all night because they were just so hungry and thirsty for knowledge and education. And that's why he worked so hard to go to the school that he went to and tried to also help pay for his family. I just think it's fascinating because I think children today take education for granted, and they don't even really, they might say that they value it, but really we live in a culture where we are amusing ourselves to death. Education and seeking out truth and facts and building up skills is really not as important as like just fulfilling your own self-desires. So this is a great book. Again, every high schooler, I'm sure it's a part of so many homeschool curriculums, but if it's not, you've got to have your child read it before they graduate. If you are enjoying these book recommendations and you want to hear my recommendations of picture books, because picture books are fun from newborn all the way up to adult. I love picture books, and I definitely have a ton of favorites, and some of my favorites are my own childhood favorite picture books that you may not necessarily find in a bookstore. You might not even find some of them in a library, but you might find some of them at garage sales, because I've picked up many at garage sales. So stay tuned, make sure you're subscribed for that book recommendation video coming soon. So my last book list is all about historical fiction read alouds that you could do. So kind of similar to Up From Slavery, although this is fiction. Amos Fortune was a slave and became a free man. This is an inspiring story, again, about working hard. There's some good conflict in here, but just kind of some insight into the Reconstruction period and how slaves were able to go from nothing and build a life for themselves. Number the Stars takes place in World War II Denmark, Nazi-occupied Denmark. This is a fascinating story about, it's fiction, but the premise of the book is what really happened in Denmark and how they were able to save their Jewish friends and neighbors. So the story is, the main characters are kind of two girls, two elementary age, I don't know, maybe teenage girls. One's a Jew and one is not, and how their families lived in the same building and were friends. And you got to read this book for some historical foundation about Denmark and how they handled the Nazis. Great, great story. And really, this is a really easy read. My son read this again in 7th grade, but I actually read it to my daughters back then too, and I think we're going to read it again. The Sign of the Beaver by Elizabeth George Spear. One thing I love about Elizabeth George Spear is she has this is another author who just has a broad use of words and introducing words like winced and contemptuous and just things that might have you stop with your kids and talk about, well, what does that mean? And if we don't know what it means, can we look at the context? Can we look it up? It takes place in the 1800s, I believe, and Pioneer in Maine. Matthew was left by his dad so his dad could go retrieve his wife and his other children. But Matthew got his gun stolen, and well, there's no grocery stores, so how are you going to get food if you don't have a gun? And he didn't really know how to properly set other traps. But another Indian in the area kind of noticed what was going on and bargained with Matthew. We will teach you how to hunt for food and how to properly become a good trapper if you teach my son, this Indian, how to read. So Matthew teaches the Indian how to read, And Robinson Crusoe is mentioned in the book because the Indian is fascinated. Well, because Matthew uses it to teach him, but then the Indian also really enjoyed the book. So if you have a child who enjoys this book, they may be inspired to try Robinson Crusoe next. Sarah Witcher's story is one of my all-time favorites. I love this book more than The Courage of Sarah Noble, and I don't know why The Courage of Sarah Noble always makes it to book recommendation lists and not the Sarah Witcher story. This took place in, I don't remember the year, but this is by Elizabeth Yates. It's kind of another pioneer era book. And the mother was out probably doing laundry in the river or something, and she left all of her children at home in the cabin to be cared for by the older children. But young Sarah wandered away, and when the mother came back, realized she was missing, and she was missing for several days, and all of the area townspeople had to gather together for search and rescue. This is a tearjerker if you are a mother. You will finish reading with tears of joy, and your children will be like, "Why are you crying?" And you'll say, "You'll understand when you're a mother." So I love this book. And then finally, The Witch of Blackburn Pond. We read this year. We also kind of listened to audiobook versions that we found on YouTube, because this is kind of a lengthy book with some small words, but it took a long time. This is about Puritan culture in the 1600s. The main character, Kit, was born and raised in Barbados on a plantation. When her grandfather died, she was uninterested in the suitor who was courting her, so she took a boat to live with her family in Connecticut around the time of the Salem witch trials. So we know that happened in Massachusetts. This takes place in Connecticut. But this isn't, even though the title suggests, oh, it's about witches, it's really not. It's about the Puritan culture, the Puritan lifestyle. It has like some complicated storylines with suitors and courtship, and just kind of like the reasons why they believed some people to be witches and all that kind of stuff. But this is a great historical novel to kind of help describe that time period. My daughters and I really enjoyed this one. If you want to know more historical book recommendations, check out my video, How I Created Homemade History Curriculum, because in there I actually did give a bunch of book recommendations to help support certain time periods. A lot of them are picture books, some of them are short chapter books, but there's a lot of book and movie recommendations in there. Hope you enjoyed this. Until next time, bye.